Hello and welcome to this breakdown of my mock-up for Marion's theme by John Williams. This was made entirely with BBC Symphony Orchestra by Spitfire Audio. And what I'm going to do today is go over why I put the mock-up together, how I put it together, and ultimately all of the details on programming it, mixings, considerations, and how I put the whole package together. The reason I put this mock-up together was because I wanted to practice my orchestral programming skills inside of a DAW. I feel very adept at looking at a page of an orchestral score and breaking it down and analyzing it and know exactly what's going on. And I wanted to be able to translate my knowledge in that realm to making something sound good on my own. And Marion's theme is a piece that I really love. I think it's just a gorgeous piece of music. Marion's theme is from Raiders of the Lost Ark, though this version is a concert version that John Williams put together. In the actual film, only the main theme is heard, not the rest of this entire thing. So I didn't do this by ear, or I didn't find the MIDI online or anything like that. I have a copy of the score to Marion's theme, which is available from Hal Leonard from the John Williams Signature series, and I believe it's in an Indiana Jones suite. So if you want to get all of those pieces, I'll link down below where you can get the score for this. My university's library had it and I checked it out there, so that's where I got the score originally. So I don't have it anymore, but I did scan it for my own personal study use. So that's what I was looking off of. Okay, so like anything, I started from the beginning. I have a copy of the score right here. I'm not going to be showing you every page, but so I started off with the strings here. The high strings are playing tremolo and the cellos have this pizzicato figure that goes on for a little bit before the main theme comes in 2 flutes and 2 clarinets. So a lot of the consideration for this and trying to adapt it to BBC Symphony is how to get a convincing actual real orchestra out of the sample library. Now, fortunately, the sample library was recorded in a way that was supposed to be pretty natural, almost classical in its sound. But I did have to make a few adjustments. So firstly, I'm working in my ultimate template. This is the template I use to score everything whenever I use Logic. Since BBC Symphony is my bread and butter orchestra, this is the main orchestra that I have loaded in here. So I have this group of several different stacks. Each of these stacks is a stem in my template, and in each stack I've broken down each section for the orchestra part. So here are all my flutes, the oboes, clarinets, bassoons, and the brass similarly in orchestral percussion. You get the idea. Now, BBC Symphony comes with one flute, solo flute series of patches. So here's the solo flute series, and then an A3 series of patches, so that's 3 flute players playing at the same time. In this score, there are 3 flute players, but there are moments where, say, 2 flutes are playing different things, so I broke out the legato, just duplicated the track to make a flute 2 track, and I did that a bit sometimes for divisi moments. For example, here are 2 viola legato tracks, and per section I have these like sort of all-in-one patches where I have a legato for the first violins, a longs, which includes every single long patch that the violins has. So of those right there. I didn't have to use much other than tremolo, longs, and legato. Okay, so let me show you the beginning again because I want to go over now how I was putting this together. So for pretty much every line in here, I was reading along to the score and playing it in. Either I had the score up on my computer right here, or I had the score on my iPad. That posed a couple of challenges, and the tough thing about writing orchestrally, or the way that a composer like John Williams writes, is that even parts that are similar aren't exactly the same. Lines are harmonized together, or there's counterpoint moments, so there's not a lot of copy and pasting you can do other than when instruments are doubled. So let me show you the beginning again. So I'm very happy with the tender sound of the woodwinds here. It's supposed to be delicate. At first, I was having an issue with instruments being too loud or too just unnatural, so I had to be very careful with how I was automating all of the lines. One thing I was able to do was to play in some lines with reading on the score and then going in and recording my automation after the fact so I can focus on the musicality. So I mentioned a little bit ago that BBC Symphony has sort of a characteristic kind of sound, and I think that's important when considering what the style of a piece of music is supposed to be in choosing the kinds of sounds that you need. So this sort of track lends itself well to being able to be performed by BBC Symphony Orchestra. If this were more intense or say an action cue from Raiders of the Lost Ark, I think it would be more difficult to pull it off with BBC Symphony Orchestra because some of the sounds maybe don't lend themselves as well to say really like articulate attacks in the brass or fast runs in the woodwinds or the strings or things like that. I haven't really tried it. Maybe I will someday. I did want to use something that would utilize BBC Symphony Orchestra well, and I think quieter dynamics in BBC Symphony sound just really, really beautiful if you can program it the way you need it to. Now, I did have a reference recording. In my template, I have this stack called DX, SFX, and Temp. That stands for Dialogue, Sound Effects, and Temp. So if I open this folder, I have separate tracks for dialogue, sound effects, and temp music so that it can be controlled while you're working on a project. You can just mute the stack and it mutes everything or unmute it. Usually the temp track is muted by default, but I have a track in here. This is a recording of Marion's theme performed by the Vienna Philharmonic when John Williams conducted it. And I think it's just a beautiful performance. It's a beautiful recording. And I was modeling sort of some of my programming and other considerations with this in mind. I listened to it several times. Once I was actually working on it though, I was listening to it less because, you know, I have to use the things that I have at my disposal. I don't have the players of the Vienna Philharmonic nor the concert hall which they perform in. Here's a little bit of it so you can hear. So gorgeous, such a gorgeous performance. I highly recommend you listen to it if you haven't already. But anyway, I had this in here just for when I wanted to look at it here and there. It wasn't the main thing that I was trying to make a one-to-one copy of. Okay, so let's talk about actually programming. Like I mentioned, I played in each of these things one at a time, each of these lines. This piece is very delicate, so it utilizes a lot of woodwinds, a lot of strings, uses harp and celeste. It uses horns, mostly tubas and trombones. There's absolutely no trumpet anywhere in this. It doesn't need it. But I got to utilize pretty much the entire woodwind section. So you can see this gradual sort of like, as it gets further and further, it overall gets louder, and that's reflected here in the automation. Let's see what it looks like if I select everything. Yeah, it's a lot of dots. This is the parameter that I'm affecting most. This is the modulation, which pretty much affects the dynamics. Now you'll also notice my tempo lane isn't bare all the way through. And this is a good opportunity to talk about the difference between, say, a film score recording session and a classical performance, because in classical music what matters most is the interpretation, the way things ebb and flow, and in terms of tempo it's not exactly rigid or metronomic the whole time. In music like this, the orchestra and conductor can take opportunities to make notes last a little longer, refrain, back off of the end of phrases and stuff like that, and that's a very important point. So listen to the beginning again and notice when I pulled back the tempo just for those moments at the ends of phrases before we begin a new one to like sort of give it this sense of tension almost. Listen. So those pickup notes, just making them last a little bit longer. If the tempo was one tempo all the way through, it would just feel like it's rushing. And this is sort of a love theme, and it just wouldn't feel right that way. I did some of this as I was going along. The majority of it was after I programmed most of it so that I wasn't getting too bogged down, being distracted by that sort of thing. I was just trying to get the notes in, because there are a lot of notes. It took several weeks to input. It's not like I was working on it like every hour of every day, but in the time I had in between here and there, I was able to do it. Also, you'll notice these markers I put in. These are the rehearsal markings that are in the score. And because in my template I start everything at bar 5, everything's shifted over by 5 measures. So I put them in to get my bearings a little easier in the score. And you'll also notice the tempo pulls back sort of at the end of rehearsal sections before it goes into a new section. For example, let's listen from here. So that was a nice satisfying pull before we brought back up to a newer speed. Also, like I mentioned, the BBC Symphony Orchestra has single legatos and then 3 legatos, and it has it for all of the woodwind sections. I utilized the A3 patch for the flutes only. Firstly, that's the only section that uses 3 of the same instrument at once in the whole piece. For the oboes, only 2 legatos. For the oboes, only 2 oboes are used at once. The third oboe is playing a cor anglais, so I have that. Then 2 clarinets. Third is supposed to be playing bass clarinet. 2 bassoons. Actually, the third bassoon player goes back and forth between bassoon and contrabassoon, so I have both engaged in this case. There were moments though where the oboe player was supposed to be playing A2 or A2, as in 2 players playing the same line. And I, more often than not, only had 1 oboe patch playing instead of the 2 oboe patches playing at the same time. Unlike, say, a moment like this where first clarinet and second clarinet, I have 2 of the same patches playing the exact same thing. For the oboe, most of the time I just had it play by itself, only because the oboe is, in this library, pretty loud, and I think it cuts through quite a bit, so I only use 1 the majority of the time, unless there are 2 different lines at once. So it's rare that I have 2 oboes playing at the same time in this case. I also don't know how much of a difference it makes if, say, clarinet 1 and clarinet 2 are playing the exact same thing. Hopefully it's triggering different samples so that they're not exactly the same and that they sound maybe a little different. I know there are tricks for making that sound different. For example, I think people will transpose the secondary instrument up a whole step and then pitch it down a whole step back so that it's using different samples so it sounds slightly different. I didn't do that, but I know that techniques like that exist. Okay, so like I mentioned, I have these all-in-one patches for each of these instruments, and this is advantageous because it would get very difficult to be able to keep track of all of the articulations when strings go back and forth from playing in different ways. In this case, a violinist will only go between playing legato or playing normal to playing tremolo. And the reason I use the longs patch is because there are moments where the violins sustain more than 1 note. So I just use a longs patch instead of 2 legato patches just to hold a chord. So I have that for the second violins and especially the violas as well. The cellos, there are many moments where it holds some notes. It might go back and forth here and there, but it's not so in your face that you can tell very much in the final performance of this. So if you're planning on doing something like this, or if you have done something like this and you'll know what I'm talking about, after having put in the notes that you need to and refining the automation so that it sounds natural, you might come to the issue of balance and instruments blending with other instruments in a way that sounds natural or isn't too jarring. For example, it can be easy in sample world for woodwinds to be way louder than they naturally would be in a concert environment. Woodwinds are typically, say, stronger than string instruments are. Like 1 flute can outplay a single violin. That's why there are 16 violins out there and only a couple of flutes, because it sort of balances out like that. However, in the sample world, you can just bring up faders, or if you focus on recording a single flute by itself and then you try to put it in the context of the rest of the orchestra, it can sound a little unbalanced. So I had to be careful with instruments not sounding too heavy in moments, and I had to battle with that a little bit with the horns. And the way I was sort of able to remedy that was, instead of using the Mix 1 mic, which is a blend of a ton of different microphones, I mostly only use 2 to 3 per instrument. So for example, in this flute patch, I have the tree mic all the way up. The majority of the outriggers, which are some microphones that are further out from the center of the conductor, which is where the tree is, the outriggers are out a little further, so it gets more of the room. And a tiny bit of the close mic, because I like a little bit of detail in what you hear. The woodwinds are sort of mic'd like that. The horn is similar. Tree out, I like a little of the detail of the horn, so I have the close mic up. For the trombones, there are moments where the trombones come in with some chords. I have the tree mic mostly up, and then the ambient mic the majority of the way up. Those are the only 2 mics that are being used in this. I wanted sort of more of the atmosphere, like the sustained chords that the trombones provided. They were just sounding a little too heavy, a little too bright, and too in the way. And in my reference recording, the trombones aren't in the way at all. They're very delicate, and they add this nice pad that all the other instruments are playing on top of. So that's why I use the ambient mic to give it a little bit more space. Similarly, the harp, for example, I have the tree, some of the outs, and a lot of the close. I have the close panned all the way to the left, because that's where in my imaginary orchestra I'm seating the harp player. And then for an instrument like the violins, I have the tree all the way up, a lot of the out, and I also have the leader mic up. The leader mic is this microphone that's right in front of the first chair player, and this adds just a little bit more of an intimate, detailed sound to the overall picture of this. I think I have a little bit of that in the cellos as well. Let me see. So I have a lot of the close up in the cellos. Let's just listen to a moment with cello legato and let's see what that does. Yeah, so that adds just a little bit of detail to the sound that I really like in cellos. I think it complements the horns very well. There are several moments in this where the cellos are playing in unison with the horns, which is very effective. Very rich, chocolatey sound is what I call it. All of the microphone positions are pretty much like that. It utilizes mostly the tree and then 1 or 2 more supplementary microphones to give it either a little bit more width or a little bit more detail depending on the instrument. So instruments that I really like to hear detail on are maybe horns, violins, cellos, maybe a little flute, maybe a little clarinet, maybe a tinge of harp, just to hear that little pluck, all very effective. And as a whole, I think it makes it sound a lot more natural. Miking position is a big part of the mixing for this. Another thing is, let me pull up my mixer so you can see it. So for many of the instruments, at least the instruments that I have engaged, I have them panned sort of to give it a little bit more of that sound, just to separate the stereo image of a lot of the instruments together. So the violins are a little closer to the left, which is where they would normally be seated. Second violins are a little to the left. The violas I keep pretty much centered, looks like. Cellos I have to the right. And basses, because of the enveloping sound, I have panned to the center. Not that the basses you hear entirely from the center, the recording itself, because the tree mic is engaged, what you'll hear is mostly to the right, but not 100%, so that makes a difference. Same thing, tuba I have to the right a little bit. Looks like trombones I did the same, and then the horns, the horn patches I use are more to the left. The problem I was sort of having was that a lot of the instruments sounded like they were coming from the center, and it was covering up other things that were supposed to be happening. So moving the horns a little bit to the left sort of made the sound of the woodwinds come a little bit closer, because I have mostly the woodwinds coming from the center rather than from the sides like some of the strings and brass instruments. Yeah, it doesn't look like I have anything panned. That looks like it was mistakenly panned that way, but whatever. Lastly, when it comes to my mixing process is all of the sweetening. So because this is my template, I have things already set up in the way that I really like hearing it. So pretty much every track has an EQ. So right here in the flutes, I have some of the high, mid-high out a little bit. Flute 2 looks like it's similar. This sort of just cleans up some of the frequencies that I don't really like. On many of these instruments, like the clarinet, the very, very low frequencies are cut out just so that any rumble that might be happening in the recording itself doesn't build up on top of itself with other samples. That's a lot of the problem with samples triggering and then cutting out, is those moments where you hear the entire audio spectrum and you don't hear it individually from one individual track to the next, but with a ton of different sample tracks, you might get a buildup of this bass. So I like to keep the bass nice and reserved for the bass instruments, so the flute has a lot cut out at the bass frequencies. By the way, if you're interested in this template, I make it available at ernestocomposer.com/templates, and I have several walkthroughs and tutorials on my template on my channel, so I'll link to a playlist where you can watch those. I highly recommend them if you're curious about this, because I go really in depth about each portion of my template. But basically, each instrument type has a few what I call sub mixes in them. So this woodwinds long track is basically all of the long woodwinds are routed to that track. So like legato and longs are sent to this longs track. So I can affect the amount of reverb I add to it, treat it how I want to treat anything else. And then these are my effects tracks, which are being bussed to each of these tracks, so I can control the amount of reverb or effects. I've spoken about this before, but I use a plugin called Cinematic Rooms Professional by Liquid Sonics. I think it's a very, very great sounding, high quality reverb. So here's the sort of sound I'm using. The Amethyst Tall is the default preset for Cinematic Rooms. Because I was referencing the Vienna Philharmonic's recording, the sound of that one has a really, like the reverb of that recording is really, really nice, and it's long. So I have a sort of longer reverb on my long tracks. So this is about 3 seconds long. And from the reflection and reverb mix, I set it to all the way to reverb, because I think the Spitfire audio sounds are really good at recording the room that everything's recorded in. So I don't need to put another like room within a room. This is sort of like a splashy sweetening reverb on top of the natural room sound that's been recorded with the tree mics and the outriggers and everything like that. So I don't need 2 rooms reflecting in there, like 8 walls or something, just the reverb sound. And because this is a algorithmic reverb, it can do that very well. You'll also notice I have this plugin right here. This is the API 550A, which is an EQ plugin. It's sort of like an analog EQ. There are only 3 bands that you can work with, a high, medium, and low. I'm not going to show you the setting for this because I got this from Trevor Morris, who asked us not to share these settings because these are the settings that he uses, which is part of his signature sound. And so I adopted them for myself. So out of respect for him, I'm not going to show you what it is. But do know that pretty much all of the tracks have that sound at the very least. The Cinematic Rooms as its reverb, and the API 550A as a sweetening EQ. Now I keep saying sweetening because, like I mentioned, there are EQs on individual tracks which are corrective, as in they cut out frequencies that I may not want, or that make, in context with other instruments, sound a little woofy or a little muddy or unclear or anything like, or something like that. And then at the end I have this EQ, which I call sweetening, which sort of enhances some of the, oh hi Noah, which sort of enhances some of the sound in other frequencies. So I boost a couple frequencies, I don't cut anything at this portion. A little bit of this stuff may be applied to a classical recording, but more often than not, no. It's just the sound of the microphones going through whatever preamps they happen to be recorded with. So it's rare that in a classical recording there's extra reverb or EQ going on, but it's common in film scoring mixes. Okay, so that was a quick look through how I put this mock-up together. If you're trying to do something like this on your own, something I would suggest is with your automation to try and make it sound as natural as possible. More often than not, maybe if beginnings of notes don't sound quite the way you want them to, which is, I ran into this a few times doing this, then maybe you can bring in the automation a little bit, so like the very, very beginning of the note starts a little softer and then like comes in sort of as a beginning articulation. And then it's really, really important for the majority of notes that the end of a note sort of like falls off naturally in volume the way a player might in real life, because it's rare that a player will go da and just completely cut off the sound dead like that. It'll be something like da. There's a little tail at the end where it sort of dies out. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the mock-up. I hope you enjoyed the breakdown. If you have any more questions, do ask down below. I'm sure I didn't cover everything, but these are the major considerations that I had in mind, or that I sort of had to discover when I was putting this together. I learned a lot doing this. I got better at mock-ups doing this. Now I'll just have to increase the variety of styles in which I mock something up. And I think it's worth practicing doing your mock-ups to recordings that actually exist, because there are all kinds of considerations when it comes to balance in the orchestra that you have to consider, especially with woodwinds and the brass and how it relates to, say, the strings and how it all blends together, the amount of reverb you have to sort of dial in, the amount of EQ boost or cutting that you're doing, just so that it all sort of fits together. I'll leave it there. Like I said, ask more questions down below. Let me know if you want to see more content like this. It was fun to put this together. I'm happy with how it came out. I'm proud of it. Hopefully I only get better from here. So thanks so much for watching, and as always, take care.